Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today.
Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of Behavior and Risk. What we're going to talk about today is the latest in a series of AI-focused episodes. And as I believe we've discussed elsewhere with technology in general, but certainly in the case of AI, we remain AI agnostic. We don't believe that AI is either good or bad. AI, though, is here to stay in all aspects of life. The genie is out of the bottle. Today, we're going to focus on AI in a specific aspect of our lives. We're going to focus on it with regards to healthcare, with a special focus on regulatory aspects, particularly here in the United States, although we will touch on regulation in other parts of the world for comparability and for potential lessons that can be learned. There are a number of uses of AI today in healthcare. For you and I, we can engage with a chatbot or digital assistant and avoid having to wait in a doctor's office on a line, maybe not even have to pay a deductible to talk with a chatbot and get some advice. More and more people are doing that today. On the other side, you have systems such as IBM Watson, which will analyze your genetics and medical history and provide you with a personalized treatment plan. Clinicians are using it for diagnosis and imaging, to be able to take a CAT scan or an X-ray and analyze it more accurately in less time, building more efficiency into the whole process. And it's also being used in surgical procedures through devices such as a cyberknife. So it's covering all aspects, whether from the clinician side, from an administrative side, or from the patient side. AI is pervasive now in healthcare, which leads to the question of, well, how is it being regulated, since it is radically new technology and there are a number of aspects of it, including the use of personal data, the protection of that data, cyber protections, all that sort of thing, as well as whether it's using the right data and coming to the right conclusion, or is it potentially magnifying bias? All of these are things that need to be considered in terms of regulation. Here in the United States, regulation, as with many things, is a patchwork framework. The most common form of getting a new AI-based device approved is through something called the substantial equivalence pathway. In fact, 97% of all authorizations are achieved through that pathway. And essentially what this means is that if you are a manufacturer using an AI-related device that has invented an AI-related device, if you can demonstrate that new device is substantially similar to a previously cleared device, you will have an expedited pathway to approval. A couple of other aspects related to regulation. There's regulation with regards to the usage of AI tools through the Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights Act. There's also rights as far as consumer protection, although they're somewhat amorphous with regards to AI. And getting things approved has been a bit challenging because the Food and Drug Administration lost 2,500 staff positions during 2025, which therefore has led to more expedited approvals and streamlining things for manufacturers. That compares and contrasts with other parts of the world, such as the EU, although it seems to be that the trend even there is towards streamlining regulation to support the continued innovation of AI in the field. John, is there anything you would like to add to what I've shared today?
I'm not really sure what I can add to that. I usually like to open our episodes with some kind of pithy comment or amusing anecdote, but in my preparation for this episode, try as I might, I couldn't find anything amusing about what we're talking about today. I don't like to go in for hyperbole, and I know you said you're AI agnostic, but I'll be fully transparent. I don't think it's exaggeration to say that today's topic concerns me more than anything else we've examined in the podcast to date. I have deep, deep concerns about the deployment and regulation or lack of regulation in the healthcare space around AI devices, tools, and approaches. And I think there is a huge class of emerging risks that are not just unaddressed, but unrecognized because of the way that certain processes and biases overlap here. I need to be very clear that I don't think that there is necessarily any sort of malicious intent by any parties in this domain. I think we're seeing, however, a very pernicious aggregation and overlap of human tendencies and cognitive biases that combine to trickle down to a very problematic degree of service. And I use sarcastic air quotes around the term service and very realistic problematic outcomes for the end user of healthcare. That is to say, patients, you and me. As you put forward, I see three main players or categories of players in this space. We have the developers, the people who are creating and selling these AI products. We have the regulators, largely government, although sometimes hospital and healthcare system oversight entities who are trying to see what is safe, what is acceptable, what is good practice. And then we have consumers. And largely what I see, and this is a very gross oversimplification, I recognize that up front, but I think it's defensible when we look at how constellations of bias occur. We have developers who are trying to offload their own risk in terms of the finances, in terms of deployment, in terms of regulatory oversight. And this falls to risk aversion. I think we have regulators who are largely swamped by this completely new class of products that 5 years ago did not exist. And they are trying desperately to simplify their own jobs. And this comes back to cognitive load and a desire for simple solutions over complex ones. And then we have consumers who really don't get to deploy any biases because their compliance is largely forced. This is something that I found really kind of horrific that within the US, at least, consumers have no right to opt out or in many cases even be informed that AI diagnostics or management is being used on them. Any one of the layers of bias in these parties is problematic, but when they combine and aggregate, I do not like the look of the medical system for the mid 21st century.
Okay, so John, I take it you're not as much AI agnostic as indicated at the beginning of this podcast, and that's fine. I think with regards to our personal health, we do need to be more cautious. And I think you bring up several excellent points here. I think one that is particularly bothersome to me in the regulatory space is the whole information asymmetry and cognitive load problem. Like, it is a well-known fact that with regards to regulation in general, regardless of industry, regardless of what aspect of regulation we're talking about, there is typically a significant information gap between those who are being regulated and those who are doing the regulating. And in the vast majority of cases, those who are being regulated have the information advantage. That's widely known. That's why there are things such as disclosures that are enforced by regulation to try to reduce some of that gap, not only with the regulators themselves, but other stakeholders, including, of course, customers and other interested third parties. I would posit in this case that the information gap is even wider. I don't even know what number to put on it. It might be 3 or 4 times as great as a typical situation just because of how rapidly the technology is developing itself. And that whatever AI was even back in January, okay, we're recording this on May 8th, 2026. I'm thinking even back to January of 2026. And if I go back a little further into 2025, when we recorded an episode on the development of DeepSeek, I would argue today that the technology has accelerated greatly, and not only in terms of what it does, but how it's being used. I don't know how regulators can keep up with it, especially in a country like the United States, where we're very much about freedom And I'm not saying that's a wrong thing. I don't want to make a political comment here. But given this country's tendency towards let's support innovation, let's support things that will move the economy forward, that will move progress, industrial progress, overall quality of life, those types of things. In this case, it's going to be a very, very difficult gap to try to close in any meaningful way.
I would argue that the developers, those people who are creating AI products for healthcare, really for AI products across the board, but in this case, very particularly for healthcare, have a vested interest in perpetuating the information gap that presently exists. You said somewhere around 2 to 3 times greater information gap than typical. I would argue that it's a qualitative information gap that makes numerical comparisons immaterial. And what I mean by this is there's regulatory interest and regulatory oversight for all manner of different products and services throughout the country. We look at, for example, the FAA and oversight of airplanes. And there's a reason I'm using this example where I'm going to come back to it for something else later. But let's look at the FAA and airplanes. People know how airplanes work. People know how they're designed. People know what the modes of failure are. So when a new airplane design comes before the FAA for regulatory evaluation, the FAA regulators know what to look for. They know what the potential points of failure are. They know what historical precedent is, and they can evaluate the new design in a meaningful way. Now, in contrast, the AI domain in general, and particularly in healthcare, is emerging so rapidly. Rich, to your point, the technology looks vastly different today than it did 3 years ago, whereas airplane design, while there absolutely have been modifications and updates and innovations, largely relies on principles that were elucidated by the Wright brothers. There hasn't really been a whole lot of fundamental design in how wings and engines push a fuselage into the air. AI, in contrast, even developers have questions as to how it works, as to what it does, as to what the points of failure are, as to what its shortcomings and limitations are. Regulators who largely do not come from the design space in AI have absolutely no clue what to look for. They have no idea what red flags they should be looking for or what sort of historical precedents exist around problems that have occurred in the past because, well, there is no past to look at. And I would argue that developers are leveraging this. They're pushing this. They want that asymmetry to persist. This allows them to basically push out a product before the regulatory framework is well defined so that the new regulations will be written to accommodate existing products or, at a bare minimum, will grandfather in existing deployed products. And this, I think, leverages a couple of very powerful cognitive biases. The fact that regulators like easiness. They like when they don't have to do a whole lot of work. And I say regulators, I really should say humans like easiness. I don't want to call out regulators specifically. We all are subject to this. Humans don't like having to update how we think about things. It takes a lot of effort. And saying, you know what? We've been using these products for the last, let's be realistic in terms of government regulation timelines. We've been using these products for the last 10 years. Sure, we'll allow them to persist and we'll write the frameworks so that this type of product is permitted to continue to exist. And this also leverages a very well-known tendency within the behavioral science domain of we tend to align our attitudes to match our behaviors. There's an intuitive sense that it should go the other way around, that our behaviors are updated to match our attitudes, but that's not the case. Research shows this over and over again. And so the longer that these developers can drive something into usage, the more likely it is that when regulations do become fully formed, they will include whatever they've already been selling for the last 10 years. So I think there is a really powerful desire and incentive on the side of developers to perpetuate this information gap and to not let the regulators catch up in terms of their understanding.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I do think that there is a lot of leveraging availability bias. And that's a lot of how the regulations are written. And frankly, this is a human matter, not specific to regulation. But if you look at the history of law and regulation and so forth, the whole idea of stare decisis in law, which is you build on precedent. What is precedent? Something that is available, something that you can point to and easily expedite a particular decision. That happens in regulation. Let's start with what we already have and let's build on it. So when there is, and I'll say in the case of AI, this is the ultimate in the variable baseline problem, which we keep coming back to again and again. So listeners, if you're sick of hearing us talk about variable baseline, look, it is a fact of life. In a world now which we live where there is every day there seems to be some new scientific or technological development. It's just something that we're going to have to deal with. And we want to bring it to your attention because it is so pervasive in risk management. It makes risk management so much harder today. And what we're talking about for you, it's not just the organizations you work for, it is just how you live your life and how you manage your health is now dealing with something where the whole framework is changing on a daily basis. And we just want to make you aware of it in terms of your risk calculus. So some of the hyperbole you may be hearing today, we are not alarmists by nature. We try to keep things relatively balanced, but some of what we're talking about is because of the fact that there is this continual variable baseline that is changing before our eyes.
I agree with that entirely, especially in regards to the state of the technology. The baseline of technology and deployment of healthcare as a practice, as a service, is fundamentally shifting before our eyes. I think one of the greatest challenges, however, is that while the practice and technology is changing, the regulatory environment has not, at least so far to date. As of May 8th, 2026, the regulatory environment has not kept pace. And lest you all think I am exaggerating on that, I think it's really important to point out that, and I'm directly quoting our researcher, Brooke, here, because she did such a phenomenal job putting this all together. I'm just going to use her words wholesale. As of December 2025, the FDA has authorized over 1,300 AI-enabled medical devices, the majority cleared through a pathway designed for static hardware in 1976. So, the present generation of AI medical devices and products are being regulated under a 50-year-old regulatory statute. This is a case of the baseline shifting enormously while the regulatory environment is basically stuck in the Stone Age and uses entirely inappropriate standards and approaches for technology that has fundamentally shifted just within 3 years. It's worth pointing out that there are three primary regulatory pathways for AI-enabled medical devices, mostly through the FDA. There's the de novo pathway, which is where you use an application for something that is fundamentally new. We're starting from scratch. Go ahead and evaluate this as though nothing like it has ever existed before. Virtually no AI products have ever used this regulatory pathway. It is an enormous standard to meet. It is a slow standard. It requires a whole lot of investigation and trials. And, well, companies don't want this because it makes it slower to market, and it means they have to invest a whole lot of money in order to clear a particular device. And realistically, in this day and age, the FDA doesn't want it because they don't have the manpower to implement that. 97% of all authorizations have been along what's called the substantial equivalence pathway, where manufacturers demonstrate that their new product is substantially equivalent to a previously cleared product, device, or practice. By definition, any sort of trained LLM or AI tool is not substantially equivalent, or more appropriately, we don't know if they're substantially equivalent because AIs are black boxes. We don't know how they are accomplishing what they accomplish. We know what the outputs are, but how they arrive at that, we have absolutely no clue. So, one, this is not an appropriate pathway. Two, I mentioned I was using FAA regulations for a reason. Substantial equivalence is a standard that's used all over the place in every domain of regulation because it makes things easier. It reduces the amount of cognitive load and simple labor that you've got to put in to clear in a particular product. You know what else was cleared by substantial equivalence? The Boeing 737 MAX. We see how well that unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go in a direction here, folks, that maybe feels a little uncomfortable or feels even a little silly, but I'm going to go down this path anyway, which is what I'm seeing is the equivalent of Frankenstein's monster, where, again, Frankenstein just put together a bunch of parts, put some juice into it, it started to breathe, but didn't know what was going to come out of it. And that's where I feel we are. So this is the equivalent of Mary Shelley's famous novel in real time. Now, again, what we're talking about are not necessarily anything that's going to do any direct physical damage, but there are definitely risks and things that I think the scary part is none of us really know could come out of it. I think we're only starting to see an emergence of some undesirable consequences.
I will go even further than that. And I will say that given that this is healthcare, there's absolutely potential for direct physical damage. And in the research we've done, I've seen instances where inappropriate decisions were made regarding healthcare. I'm going to use this particular example. I'm not specifically trying to call out this company or product. I'm simply using it because it is widely deployed and has been in use for a while, and its functionality is really not what one would hope for in the context of population level healthcare. And this is Epic's sepsis prediction model. This is something that is embedded in the electronic health record system, services approximately 54% of US healthcare patients. Now, think about that. I don't recall ever signing up or signing on to this sepsis prediction model. Do you, Rich?
Nope.
Nope. These are being deployed without any patient knowledge or understanding. Now, in the case of this sepsis prediction model, what Epic attempts to do is look at all of the aggregating factors within an electronic health record and try to predict which patients are likely to experience problematic sepsis during or subsequent to treatment. And at the recommended alert thresholds, their model misses 67% of sepsis cases and generates alerts for 18% of all hospitalizations. And in addition to missing two-thirds of cases, this means that clinicians have to evaluate approximately 109 false alerts for every true positive. This is going to create genuine negative outcomes. You have the missed true positives, two-thirds apparently, and then you have, with that level of 110 to 1 for false positives to true positives, you're going to have physicians who basically become blind to real cases. This is going to create problematic outcomes. I don't want to say this as an alarmist. I don't want to say this in terms of, oh, AI is doomed. But when you look at the way healthcare is delivered, if you've got a 110 to 1 evaluation rate, people are going to die. Full stop.
Yeah, this is the ultimate in massive type 1 and massive type 2 error. I don't even know where to go. I don't know how to react other than just to echo what you've said here, that it's just going to lead to a lot of folks in body bags, unfortunately.
It
Um,
is. And it's concerning because if there were a boogeyman, if there were a villain we could point to and say there's a mustache twirling person somewhere in the backgrounds who's caused this to happen, it would be easy to fix. I don't think there is, though. I think that this is just a very predictable and natural consequence of this hodgepodge environment that you've pointed out. Yes, we can argue that developers should try to be better at what they're doing, that they should not push products to market, but in order to stay financially afloat, they have to. They have to push products to market. Another element that I think supports all of this is that under present regulatory environment in the US, developers don't really have liability for failures in their products, specifically AIs. AI developers do not really have liability. The liability on false positives, false negatives largely falls onto the healthcare institutions. And so there's not a huge disincentive to pushing out a half completed product and saying, you know what, we'll fix that in 2.0. And honestly, looking at what's happening, When I say it's reasonable, I don't mean it's something that we should say is okay and acceptable. I'm saying that, yeah, it's not surprising that this is what we're seeing. This is not a consequence of someone saying, I'm going to kill all the people and make all the money. This is just a consequence of, well, when you align incentive this way, this is what you get.
Yeah, absolutely. Intertemporal discount is really strong. And a lot of these AI developers, a lot of the reason that there's so much investment going into AI in a number of different applications is because there is an expectation by investors of getting a return. So therefore, developers are going to take paths that are going to provide the least resistance and provide the quickest return because we all want more sooner. That is how behavior works. That is a fundamental aspect of it. That if we can avoid things that will increase cost, increase outlay today, we're going to do it, especially when there are pressures, when there are expectations, when there are demands for underlying returns, and when there's an implicit reciprocity when you take somebody's hard-earned money and invest it for something that you're promising good things.
A question that comes up that I think is fair and a very reasonable question to ask is, well, okay, we know that the regulatory framework is not appropriate for AI. We know that the standards that are currently being deployed are 50 years old. They were designed for static devices like a surgical stent or a retractor, not for a black box computer system. Why haven't the FDA updated the regulations? And this is another instance, I think, of one of those most pernicious of all biases, inertia. And this is both on the human level and on the organizational level. Rich, you and I have both worked with and for large companies in the past. And while the FDA is not a company, it is certainly a large organization. And we've both seen this. Getting a large organization to change how it does things is like pushing a rope. It takes years, if not decades, of committee meetings and internal memos and reports and shareholder or stakeholder evaluations. And at least three generations of senior leadership are going to have to come and go before you can get a substantive change in the philosophy and structure of the organization. Well intentioned as I like to think federal cabinet administration agencies are, we can parse the validity of that out in a different episode, but let's assume well-intentionedness on their part. It's simply not realistic for these to change quickly. And I think that, as I mentioned, that's something that the developers are very aware of and are leveraging. I also think that, well, okay, why are they continuing to use these standards? Why do they not apply a stricter eye, knowing that these standards are inappropriate? And I think that because we don't have any sort of valid regulatory frameworks we can look at, even in, for example, the EU or Japan or Singapore or other markets we've examined, given that there's no valid established regulatory framework, we have a problem with the law of the instrument. This is what we have. Yes, it's 50 years old, but this is the tool that we have. When the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you have periods of deep uncertainty, there is not just a tendency, there is an enthusiasm to embrace things that you know you have used in the past because you know they work. They may not work for what you're trying to do, but they work for some things. And so you go ahead and use them. And I don't know how we move past that.
I'm not sure you do, especially given where I thought you were going to go, John. So I'll take it to another part of it. There's definitely the law of the instrument aspect of it, which again is connected to availability, to representativeness. All of these things that Kahneman and Tversky brought to the forefront 50 years ago are still valid, maybe even more valid today in terms of analyzing behavior and the underlying risks that they create unwittingly. Beyond that, what we've also talked about on this podcast and a number of things is the whole group dynamic. And the fact that I remember a colleague of mine many years ago telling me, if you really want things done, don't have a committee. If you want radical change, if you want something that's going to move things forward, don't do it through committee. You need an executive. And that's why, even with regards to our form of government here in this country, I don't want to go down the path of autocracy or anything like that, but the way it's supposed to work is that certain key things are left to an executive. And that's why the election of the president is the highest profile election here, is because there are certain things that you want to have done expeditedly, and therefore you have an individual. We know that the usage of groups has many positive aspects to it and can lead to an offsetting or mitigation of biases within individuals within a particular group. We also know that, as we talked about extensively, there is the definite potential for groupthink. And combined with the law of the instrument, availability, representativeness, those are going to come to the forefront in a group setting. There is going to be a natural tendency within the group to stick with things that are known, things that have worked in the past. It winds up being a group setting application of why we have inertia. Why do we have inertia within ourselves individually? Because we got to this point in our lives, whether it's 30 years, 40 years, 70 years, doing certain things that we do, and we're still alive. It's the same thing with regards to the success of a particular or perceived success of a particular institution. It comes to play in a group setting and tends to be pervasive. So if you really want things done, there's almost got to be sort of a workaround, maybe a tiny group where you have three people who have enough differences within them. And again, I'm picking a random number here, but with the way things tend to work in large institutions, whether private or public, to get a representation of enough of different viewpoints, you need to have a large number. And when you have a large number, that can easily get bogged down.
We call this out specifically in our textbook that for all the benefits and appeal of group processes, there are certain things where just having one person ultimately have total custody of a decision really does make certain things better. I also think of one of my favorite cynical quotes of all time, which is, "A camel is a horse designed by committee."
That is a great one.
It's a
That is
great
really
one.
good.
It's very cynical, but it also, I think, quite validly and accurately captures what we see with the regulatory framework of the FDA in general, and especially what we're seeing in terms of AI devices and services in healthcare.
Yeah, it's really a challenge. And I guess just to take it a little bit further, I would say that groupthink is something that feeds on what I've been noticing a lot more as I get older. And I notice it clearly in myself, which is conflict aversion. You have a situation where you have folks that are just trying to get things done, and no one wants to be perceived as a bottleneck. No one wants to be perceived as prohibiting progress from moving forward. And I think that gets to something we've been talking a lot about the behavior side. We've mentioned a little bit about risks in general, but I'm going to take it back to the whole risk management perspective. And that a lot of what tends to come out are risk calculus in terms of what is the underlying priority. And in my humble opinion, and I don't want to put a right or wrong here on it, although it's going to probably sound like that, there has been a risk calculus with regards to managing the risk of AI, that the bigger risk, the risk where we're going to put weight, the greatest weight, is on not allowing the technology to progress and falling behind in some way, shape, or form, whether it's falling behind other countries or just the general perception that there are missed opportunities, and that not enough weight is being placed on the risks of unforeseen consequences and potential cataclysmic safety risks that could occur.
I'll be even more direct and say it out loud. I'll say the quiet part out loud without any hesitation. The vast majority of US policy towards AI development and implementation is being driven by fear of falling behind China. Now, that is probably its own conversation. There's lots of different things we could say about that, and I don't want to make this a political conversation, but I don't think it's a political statement. I think it's a statement of fact that this fear of losing the great powers competition is driving a whole lot of risk-taking behavior in the deployment of AI within the United States.
And I would say, again, just to make it clear for our audience, we are not being political in this. I really don't believe it is specific to one party or another. I believe this is a universal fear, a universal driving force within all of the major institutions that drive progress in this country. So, one thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up is just the whole clinician aspect of it. Because, John, you mentioned earlier that the liability tends to not fall with the manufacturers, but tends to fall with the clinicians, which brings up a really interesting risk calculus for them. Because if they do adopt new AI, they put themselves at risk of whatever potentially adverse consequences comes out from deploying it for the various processes that they use them for. And I mentioned a number of them in my opening. On the other hand, if they don't adopt AI or the latest version of it in some way, shape, or form, or deploy it in some way, they may fall behind other competing institutions for business. And that leads to a very, very challenging risk calculus because, again, I don't think most folks go to medical school necessarily learning the skill sets that they need to be able to accurately assess how the AI is working, to be able to get inside the black box. I don't think there's a whole lot of folks within these institutions that have that skill set. Folks that are running various hospitals, various medical groups, and so forth are largely just focused on the outputs. What kind of information is coming out of it? And I would hope being able to assess any testing data that is coming along with any pitch to use a particular AI tool. Nevertheless, it's a challenging area for them. I would say it's one of those, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, in terms of that. So I don't know if you have any reaction to that, John.
I do. And I think that you raise a really important point, but I think we need to be a little more precise in how we parse this out. Because yes, liability does fall to the healthcare organizations themselves. Now, that phrasing is very important. The healthcare institutions, the healthcare organizations, not specifically the clinicians, unless they are independent providers or operators. And what this means in practice is that a great number of these AI tools, for example, the Epic sepsis prediction model or the Optum algorithm, which has its own saga we haven't even begun to address, these are things that clinicians are not going to select or reject. These are things that hospital and healthcare system administrators are going to select and implement. These are people who are not directly part of the chain of healthcare delivery. Now, there's a lot to be said and to be studied from a risk management point of view in terms of the structure of healthcare delivery, both in the States and elsewhere. We might have something like that under preparation right now. But it means that clinicians don't necessarily have as much of a say in whether or not these tools are employed as we might assume they do. Now, some of them, yes. I'm aware of one of the earliest cases of AI deployment in healthcare was evaluation of radiology imaging, of CT scans and MRIs, where AI engines were able to very effectively detect cancer at early stages when treatment was much more viable than at later stages. And I'm not really aware of any clinicians who would reject something like that. But when we're talking about how the electronic health record is maintained and evaluated, clinicians are never going to be part of that decision. That's entirely an administrative decision. And that's, I don't want to say it's entirely a business decision, but it's far more of a business decision than we as healthcare users would like to assume.
So this becomes effectively a classic ERM decision. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I would posit that for all of those who are making those decisions at these healthcare institutions, that I would strongly recommend doing some type of scenario analysis. And one of the hard things with doing scenario analysis in this case is, what does a credible worst case scenario look like? Which is always in my humble opinion, where one should go when deploying this. You really need to step back and think about what happens if we make this decision and it goes sideways.
I agree entirely. I think credible worst case scenario analysis is good practice for any kind of decision making. Unfortunately, the regulatory structure where the manufacturers don't really bear any liability results in a bit of an arms race. You can do a credible worst case scenario analysis and say, okay, our credible worst case scenario is we experience X number of fatalities in the next 5 years. But as we've talked about, you can do ERM completely correctly and still have negative outcomes because it's all probabilistic. And so part of the calculus is always going to be, what if we reject this and that competing healthcare system over there embraces it and saves $3 million over the next 5 years? It creates a real sense of loss aversion of what if we don't adopt this? And that's going to contaminate any of that credible worst case scenario analysis that people do. I think really the only way to get around that is to shift the custody of liability to the manufacturers themselves, at least partially, or make industry standard a shape of contract where if liability does fall to healthcare systems, then it is written in the contract that the manufacturer shares X percentage of that liability. Now, I think good luck trying to sell that, but that's really the only solution I see to balancing those interests.
It does become a risk appetite question. And we haven't spoken specifically about that. We've danced around the risk appetite issue. Look, I agree with where you're coming from with this. On the other hand, I do think, again, it comes back to what is the perception of this risk and what's the risk preference. And in my humble opinion, I believe there is a significant amount of underperception of risk or underestimation of risk is maybe the best way to put it. I'm not sure that those who are making these calls fully appreciate what they're potentially facing. And whatever credible worst case scenario they are creating are in some way either understating it or normalizing it in some way, maybe through some sort of subjective estimation of probability, and therefore finding some appropriate business case rationale to say, yeah, we're going to take this on.
We have a really difficult scenario where we have two combining dimensions. We have human health outcomes, which have fundamentally a huge amount of variability and are very difficult to predict on an individual level. And we have AI, where we have these brand new tools that are black boxes that nobody really knows how they work. And so we have uncertainty adding on to uncertainty. And we see this in every domain of human endeavor. We see this in all of the research that when you have that much uncertainty, heuristic thinking predominates. There's no way around it, unfortunately. So maybe then the best, call it national level or population level approach to mitigating this is to try to reduce the uncertainty, to try to, rather than specifically say, here's how we improve the frameworks or here's how we more effectively perform credible worst case scenarios. Instead, maybe the focus should be on how do we better understand what exactly these tools are and how do we push that information nationwide or institution wide so that people can more effectively make decisions around them. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here. It may not be practical, but I wonder if reducing the uncertainty is really the best risk management strategy in this particular dimension.
So I think we've come full circle for our audience here, and I think we can get to a closing point actually rather efficiently. I think you've hit on it, and I'm going to try to articulate it as best I can. The solution or potential solution, and again, we're very open to whatever our audience has. I'm sure we've got folks out there listening that have some great ideas on this. But as we see it here, it's a fundamental challenge trying to achieve the right balance between providing more information, providing sufficient information to make good decisions, and not driving cognitive overload. Because we know for all of you out there who've read any representations and warranties in some type of product where there's all this legal boilerplate, nobody reads it. Nobody reads it. It's overwhelming. I don't read it. I'm being candid. I mean, I get all sorts of things all the time, and a lot of it's in medical disclaimers. I'll read and I'll scan a little bit of it, but it's like, oh my God, this is so much legalese. We need to find a way to educate folks to be able to use relatively simple language to explain to them what these models are doing and what the potential pitfalls are that could come out of it. So to at least explain what we know and what we don't know, and to be able to fundamentally describe what the uncertainty is so that folks can make their own choices.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.